Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kevin Quigley. I'm the Scholarly Director of the MacEachen Institute for Public Policy and Governance. Thanks so much for joining us for the launch of the 2019 Policy Matters Speaker Series. So delighted to see such a great turnout. So very exciting for us. We're going to be talking about an important policy topic today. So, and I see by the turnout that you're as excited as I am and as we are at the MacEachen Institute. We start by acknowledging that we're at Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I think we should also maybe pause for just 1 second and acknowledge that we've had a phenomenal, crazy last few days in Halifax and in Nova Scotia because of our friend Hurricane Dorian. And so I think I'm going to ask for a round of applause for emergency services. They've done a great job. And we also want to thank you for coming because I'm sure many of you have very unusual stories to tell about how your weekend unfolded. So I'm sure I wish you well in the recovery process that's been going on for some of us for another few days yet. The MacEachen Institute aims to be the go-to place for public policy discussion and analysis locally, regionally, and nationally. In our 3 short years, our institute's hosted over 50 events. We've welcomed almost 4,000 people to these events. We've been in the media over 300 times, and 83,000 minutes have been viewed of our material online. We're very gratified that the community has engaged with the Institute and the great scholars and thought leaders who've come to talk about these important policy discussions. We're looking forward to another very exciting fall series. When we launched this year's series and the naming of our new fellows, we were delighted by the huge response online, the number of unique visitors that came to our website to check out our material. So there's clearly a lot of interest for important public policy discussions, and we're delighted to facilitate those discussions for you. In an age of fake news, a source of reliable and trustworthy information, of course, is extremely important, and that is particularly the case this fall because a fall election is on the horizon, though I note that the writ has not yet been dropped. This fall, we're going to have 10 great talks. We're going to welcome 40 expert speakers, top academics from Dalhousie and from across the country. We'll also have journalists and thought leaders from a variety of sectors, public and private. They'll all be discussing important policy issues. It's important to recognize that we could have picked another 10 topics from the 10 that we picked this year. There's no end to the number of topics you can pick for important public policy discussions, but we landed on the 10 that we did, and the 6 in particular that will precede the federal election because we think that these are important federal policy issues. We think people want to hear about it, and we also think there are academics and thought leaders who have important things to say about it. One of the things we want to do is provide leading thinkers an opportunity to provide some thoughts on their research and their reflections on these important policy topics. So a certain aspect of what we're doing in Policy Matters is to host talks where we think we have something important to say. So I think that every week you're going to see some top-flight people coming on these important issues, saying things, shaping our thinking a little bit, influencing our thinking, and engaging with the community. An important part of what we do here is engage with the community. So there's going to be lots of opportunities to ask questions, tough questions, if you like, to these exceptional people. So one of the goals is to connect the local with the national and the national with the local. Starting today and for the next 6 weeks, or let's just say we'll start with next week's panel, we'll be talking about food policy. The week after that, we're going to talk about the future of work. Then we're going to talk about energy security. We're going to talk about climate change. We're going to talk about reconciliation and child welfare. Those talks are all happening right here at noon on Tuesdays. So we welcome you to join us every week for those talks. You can join us physically in this space, or you can join the live stream, or you can watch on our YouTube channel after the event is over. All the material is stored by the end of the week. We encourage, of course, you to follow on Twitter and get information as it unfolds. We deliberately decided not to invite a lot of politicians this fall. And that's partly because politicians are going to be extremely busy and they're very hard to schedule. And we thought that we'd also like to play a different role in informing the community as the election approached. However, We will have one exception, and that's going to be on September 23rd, which is 2 weeks yesterday. It's going to start at 7 o'clock. We're going to be hosting a talk called The Road Ahead, a political conversation about the future of Atlantic Canada. It'll be at the Irving Auditorium in the Richard Murray Design Building on Moore Street, the Sexton campus. We will be live streaming it, and the conversation will feature former Premier Darrell Dexter, Janice Harvey, longtime activist from the Green Party. The Honorable Peter MacKay will be here. The Honorable Anne McLeod will also be here, the Chancellor of Dalhousie. The information will be on our website later this week. That's an evening talk, as I say, 7 o'clock. The Road Ahead, a political conversation about the future of Atlantic Canada. We encourage you all to come, and everyone has to bring several friends, okay? So we look forward to that event. That's our one event where we're a little bit getting into a little more partisan space and asking different political parties to, and we wanted to bring in people who, experienced people who'd really held some of the top jobs, and to give us some things to think about what they think some of the challenges are for the Atlantic region, how we connect with Ottawa, things we should be thinking about as this election approaches. So we encourage you all to come. Today's panel, Democracy and Manipulation in the Internet Age, of course, is going to start us off, and we're very excited about this panel, this topic, and the exceptional people that we have to lead us through this discussion. I'm going to leave it to Tom Clark to introduce this panel, but I'll just say a word about our chair, Tom Clark. Tom Clark is the Chair of Public Affairs and Communications at Global Public Affairs. He joined Global Public Affairs almost 45 years almost 45 years at the most senior levels of Canadian journalism. At Global News, he was the network's chief political correspondent and host of the West Block. He's interviewed every Canadian Prime Minister since Lester B. Pearson and has covered every federal election campaign since 1974. He's reported in 8 active war zones and from over 33 countries. Mr. Clark was CTV's China Bureau Chief and was also its Chief Washington Correspondent for 5 years. He has a deep understanding of Canada's position in an increasingly complicated international dynamic. Tom is the recipient of Radio Television Digital News Association Lifetime Achievement Award and has been named one of the most influential journalists in Ottawa. Please join me in welcoming Tom Clark.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in. Every time I hear an introduction like that, I'm tempted to say, you know, as I was saying to Wilfrid Laurier, I was telling him about the time I met John A. Macdonald. Anyway, seriously, thank you very much for having me here today. It's a great topic, a great panel. And I just wanted to start by saying that, you know, one of the most persuasive people I've ever met is my friend Darrell Dexter, who works with me at Global Public Affairs. But I just want everybody to acknowledge the fact that today is Darrell's birthday. And you know how he found out it was his birthday? Seriously, he didn't know. He had to change his password, and they asked him for his birthday. And he typed it in, and he went, oh my God, that's today. So I am going to, the way we're going to do this is that I'm going to introduce each panelist. They'll have a little bit of time to sort of lay out a little bit of what they want to talk about in their area of expertise. Then we're going to get into a discussion, and then of course we want to involve all of you in that as well. We all come from away, as they say. We're in various parts of central Canada, which does make me think that one of the reasons I love Haligonians and why I love Nova Scotia is because last week we in central Canada, me in Ottawa, some others in Washington, D.C. and Toronto, were seized with the fact that we had some really bad thunderstorms. Essentially, you guys said, here, hold my pint. So I love that. Let me start off. I'm with Darrell at the stage where I actually need glasses. Oh, there we are. Okay. I'm going to start off with Dr. Elizabeth Dubois. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication and a member of the Center for Law, Technology, and Society at the University of Ottawa. She is, however, from Dartmouth, so she's legitimate, don't worry. Her work examines political uses of digital media, including media manipulation, citizen engagement, and artificial intelligence. Her public writing has appeared in Maclean's, the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, Policy Options, The Conversation, and Salon. So, with that, Dr. Dubois, the floor is yours.
Thank you. That's not right. Let's try this one. There we go. All right, so thank you guys for having me today. Quick note about me, if you want further information, you can find me on Twitter, Liz Dubois. These slides have already been posted there, so you're welcome to go take a look. I know my Twitter handle is confusing. I don't actually go by Liz. It's a whole long story. We can get into it later. But the core thing that I want to talk to you today about is what media manipulation looks like in the context of a media ecosystem. And then I'm going to drill into specific kinds of actors, particularly political bots, in the 8 minutes I've got today. So this idea of the ecosystem basically means, at its core, that we can't be thinking about any individual actor or any individual piece of technology to really understand the implications for our digital media system and our election. We need to be thinking about them in interaction with each other. An automated script on social media, like a political bot, which is designed to mimic real human behavior but isn't actually a real human doing the behavior, that bot has to interact with people to have any sort of impact, right? If that bot exists and nobody pays attention to it, then it doesn't really have an impact on our electoral system. If a journalist starts reporting on it and then a whole bunch of people start following it, then it might have a much larger impact. Similarly, political actors like politicians or third-party actors, people within civil society, all of those different kinds of actors make use of technology in a variety of different ways, sometimes by creating bots to do useful things, sometimes by creating bots or other technologies to do malicious things. And in making use of those technologies in innovative ways, they recreate what our ecosystem actually looks like. So these political bots are difficult for a bunch of reasons. One of them is it's really hard for us to actually stick with one definition of what we mean. So you might have heard of the Russian bots, right, that we were all really, really afraid of in the US context. And there are Russian bots that existed within Canadian Twitter spheres as well in the last election, and probably exist right now, although Twitter's doing more work to try and get rid of them. But this idea of automated accounts that were created by one particular government is not actually what we see when we look at what bots exist. So what we actually see is a variety of bots that are entirely automated accounts created by a bunch of different people, both foreign and domestic. We also see spam, which we are accustomed to, probably in our emails, maybe phone calls, messages that sometimes are automated and sometimes aren't automated, and they have the intent of kind of throwing us off course. And then we have trolls, which we usually think of as actual humans who do things that are kind of spammy and sometimes look like they might be automated. So I've got 3 examples here. Tay is a bot that Microsoft created. It was supposed to be a teenager on Twitter. She was manipulated and very quickly became a Nazi on Twitter. Not great, not great. Microsoft took Tay down right away as soon as this happened, because that is immoral and problematic. Net neutrality debates in the US, we saw an open call for feedback from what was supposed to be individuals, citizens in the US. It was found out that actually there was a spammer who submitted a whole bunch of responses to that request, and then that led to a manipulation of what actually the public thought about net neutrality. Right? But we framed it as spam, even though that was kind of a bot also. And then we have accounts like MacEachen, which was a Twitter account that looked very much like a pro-Trump bot during the last election. Actually turns out it's a Canadian who lives in Southern Ontario. And he talked to a journalist and said, nope, that's fully me. I just like to act like a bot. Right? So it gets a little difficult to actually understand who these different bots are, and we have cyborg accounts, which often are part automated, part human managed, because they're a lot harder to track. But as a starting point, my colleague Fenwick McKelvey, who's at Concordia University, and I looked at the 2015 election, looked at Twitter conversations around that election, and we found 4 different types of bots, which I'm going to run through quickly today: amplifiers, dampeners, servants, and transparency bots. So the amplifiers amplify things. They like to make messages really loud and really noticeable. They try and fake support. They try and create this appearance of consensus when it doesn't actually exist. They often also target and exacerbate existing polarized views within society. On the flip side, we have these dampener bots, which have the exact opposite goal. Their whole goal is we're going to try and make your voice not as loud. That message that we don't like, not as prominent. And so here, the tactics are usually confusion and obfuscation. They try and push away, create a chilling effect. Harassment and hate speech are very common tools within this dampening approach. You might consider the example of feminists on Twitter, where for a while, every time you said the word feminist on Twitter, an army of bots were thrown at you to the point where you no longer used that word, and sometimes you just got off Twitter altogether. Twitter, to their credit, has fixed this problem and modified their bot detection algorithm to deal with this, but it was a real thing that existed and impacted many people for many months. Both of these kinds of bots have as their main goal to game the algorithm. Their whole goal is to say, we know that social media and search engines require algorithms to curate our information and decide what information we get to see. And so we are going to figure out ways to shift what that trending topic is, to shift what that recommended video is, to shift what those top search results or newsfeed items are. But not all bots are bad. There's some really helpful ones. Servant bots are ones that do things that are repetitive tasks automatically. Humans are really bad at doing the exact same thing the exact same way every single time. Computers, it turns out, really excellent at it. And so we have servant bots that do a really good job of posting things across a bunch of different platforms, as an example. We also have transparency bots, which do a really good job of digging through massive amounts of open data, or sometimes closed data, and then surfacing only the most important bits so that we as a population or journalists are able to more easily focus on what actually matters and what doesn't in a massive data set. So, now that we've got a sense of who these bots are, how or should we regulate them? Well, I've argued that in the context of elections, we need to be thinking about the role of automation, because automation can do a really good job in terms of helping get out the vote, but it could also be very problematic in terms of spreading information that is misleading, sending people to the polls at the wrong place, doing something akin to robocalls, which you may remember from the last federal election. We also have an issue where bots are used as promotional tools, and right now our definition of political advertising doesn't actually deal with that, but we do know that people are spending money on bots to try and promote messages, and so when we think about our election spend and how we regulate that, we need to think about how that might play out and how we would like as a society to deal with innovative uses of technologies. And then the last thing I want to end on is the idea of manipulating public opinion. A lot of the more malicious bots, but some of the actual useful ones too, have as their goal to shift public opinion, to shift your ideas about what is good, what is bad, who to vote for, who to ignore, who to pay attention to, right? And so these bots work at least on 2 different levels. One is to connect with us via our social media, via our search engines, via our instant messaging, and shift the conversations we're having as communities in our groups. They also work by targeting journalists specifically, because while social media is a source of political information for many Canadians, it is not the most relied upon source, and it is not the most trusted source. For that, most Canadians still go to traditional news media. They've got their specific outlets that they trust and go to. Now, if you have journalists through those platforms reporting on the trending topics that have been manipulated, suddenly it's not just the relatively small group who are seeing it on social media, but it's the wider Canadian population who are engaging with it and now see that commentary as more trustworthy because it came from a political journalist who they already trust. And so with that, I will end it. I am looking forward to the rest of the discussion here. I'll note that in the rest of this slide deck, which you can find online, I've got a couple of other policy conversations and links that might be helpful to you. Thank you.
And trust me, Elizabeth has got a lot more to say than just what you've seen there. I'd like to introduce you now to Natasha Gauthier. She is a spokesperson and senior media relations advisor at Elections Canada, otherwise known as Ground Zero for all this stuff. She has more than 20 years' experience as a journalist and media relations and crisis communications expert in public, private, and not-for-profit sections. Prior to joining Elections Canada last year, I think it was, Natasha, you joined, she was a spokesperson at Transport Canada and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. And from 2012 to 2014, she was Director of Communications at the Public Policy Forum. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Natasha Gauthier.
Hi, everyone. Super happy to be here. And I'm going to preempt everyone's first question. No, I have no idea when the red is going to drop, so at all. We are as in the dark as you all are about that, but it will be soon. The deadline is they have until the 15th. So, sorry, we're going to set up.
I'll put up your slides here.
Thank you. It's not mine. Yeah, that starts there. Yeah, perfect. Okay, and then how do I?
I would just go click next.
This one?
Yeah. Oh no, you can go. Just the cursor.
Oh, okay, perfect. Thank you. Sorry. All these layouts are different. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about exactly what Election Canada's role is in the broader electoral security matrix, the ecosystem that is overseeing the security and transparency of the election system in Canada. I'm also going to provide an overview of some of the specific actions that we're taking, systems that we've been putting in place over the past year at least, and going back further as well in preparation for the upcoming election. And I'm going to end with an outline of our social media monitoring strategy, because that's something new, this very expanded role for social media monitoring at Elections Canada. So election security is not new at Elections Canada. It's something we've always done. We've always emphasized security. We've always had to deliver elections in the midst of situations like floods, blizzards, hurricanes. So the security itself is not a new thing at Elections Canada. What has changed is that the threats that we're facing have morphed. Digital threats, whether domestic or foreign, have become the new reality. Now, that being said, our paper-based system provides a lot of protection. So at the federal level, we still use paper ballots, marked and counted by hand. You can't hack a paper ballot. But that doesn't mean that other systems are not at risk. So securing elections goes far beyond Elections Canada or any single agency. As I mentioned, we're part of an ecosystem of election security. No single organization can protect a modern election, and it requires a whole of society approach. So, yes? Am I too short? Oh, okay. Okay, I will try to speak up. I'm getting over bronchitis, so I apologize. So this gives you a good overview of, who really is involved in election security, and it's pretty broad, right? You've got political actors, so that's candidates, parties, third parties who play an important role during elections, the social media platforms themselves, media, journalists, the Commissioner of Canada Elections. Who can tell me the Commissioner's job? What's their job? So the Commissioner is actually the one who receives complaints about violations of the Act, and they investigate and take enforcement action as required. So a lot of people think that that's Elections Canada's job. It's not. It's the Commissioner of Canada Elections. They are a separate independent office. In most provinces, the provincial electoral body is also the investigator, but that's not the case at the federal level. The Critical Election Incident Public Protocol, that is a mouthful, but this is this new group of senior civil servants that you may have heard about that they've established, who will be ready to examine and intervene in the case of a serious threat to the election and our democratic process. And who's on that panel? So the Clerk of the Privy Council, also known as Canada's senior civil servant, National Security and Intelligence Advisor, the Deputy Minister of Justice, as well as the Deputy Attorney General for Canada, the Deputy Minister of Public Safety, and the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. And you'll note that the Chief Electoral Officer of Canada is not on that panel, because we are independent from government. Elections Canada plays a role, the security agencies, so CSIS, the CSE, Communications Security Establishment, Public Safety, Global Affairs Canada, the RCMP, local law enforcement authorities. These are all people who play a role. And finally, academia and civil society. I won't go into a lot of detail on this slide, but this is basically an overview of how that critical incident protocol, public protocol group would work in the event of a threat. So I'll just let you look at that a little bit. So they set it up so that there's certain thresholds that have to be met before before moving on to the next level, if you will. So awareness, sharing information, assessing the threat, and then, if needed, a public announcement. So what is Elections Canada's role? So our job is defined, our mandate is very clearly outlined in the Canada Elections Act, and that is to administer the election and make sure that people have the right information and are not impeded in their efforts to register and vote, and that they have the right information about where, when, and ways to register and vote. So we are here, as I said, to administer the election. We secure our own systems and our own data. We make sure Canadians have the right information. And as I said, a lot of this is not new. There are many things that we have always done in elections. As I said, the nature of the threat is sort of what is new in the environment, and the speed at which these threats can develop as well. So what do we not do? So here's what we're not. We're not a security agency. That's why we work with partners in the security field. We do not determine the source of any potential interference or information. That is not our role. We are not the arbiter of truth on the internet. So we don't police the internet, we can't, and it's not our mandate. And we don't investigate or enforce the act. As I said, that's the commissioner's role. So what have we been doing? So a variety of things. We've increased the security of our internal systems, our networks, our data centers. We've ensured that all staff at Elections Canada, from administration, whether they're intimately involved in delivering the election to support staff, have been trained. Mandatory training was imposed on identifying phishing, because this has been identified as a potential threat to the election, that potential malicious actors are not necessarily going to try to hack into our systems or steal data. They're going to try to get in. It's much easier now for them to get in by just getting a naive employee to click on a link that then sends malware to you. So all of the staff have been trained on identifying those threats. We've conducted a range of tabletop scenario exercises, and that's a government e-speak for basically simulation exercises with all of our partners. We've put in place a social media monitoring unit with a clear mandate to look for three things: incidents that could affect the smooth administration of the election, inaccurate information about the election process, and any social media accounts and websites that impersonate Elections Canada or the Commissioner of Canada elections. And those are two things that are prohibited by the Canada Elections Act. They're illegal. You can take legal action against people who are doing that. And I'll go into more detail about the roles and functions of that social media monitoring team in a minute. We've also set up a repository on our website listing all of our communications products. We did election simulation exercises as well earlier this spring, where we tested all of the systems, created a bunch of scenarios that went from, there was one scenario where, the returning officer, their office has been broken into and their laptops have been stolen. So what would we do? What are the systems in place? So you practice all of this ahead of time. Let me go into a little bit about the social media monitoring team to finish up. So why do we monitor? To anticipate and prepare for potential issues and incidents, detect issues earlier, analyze the scope, recognize patterns and connections, and measure the impact of our response. So we have a number of dedicated teams at Elections Canada. We have the Media Relations and Issues Management team, whose job is specifically to monitor journalist social media accounts. We have the Electoral Integrity Office team. They monitor for information incidents not directed at our social media accounts, but that mention the election as well. And then our core social media team that monitors people, who are sending direct messages or tweeting or sending Facebook messages at Elections Canada, whether they're complaining or asking questions. These people are on it. We have a new social media monitoring tool that machine translates 40+ languages, social media messages, recognizing that threats won't necessarily come in English or French. And our monitoring staff that we've hired are fluent in around 12 languages. Again, we check for 3 types of information: inaccurate information about the election process, indicators of any incidents that could affect election delivery, and that's really important. Because to us, it's not only the bots and the trolls, that can impact the election security, but it's regular things. Like if the election had been going on now, we were monitoring all weekend for the situation in Halifax and Nova Scotia. So, time's up. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. If you monitor my social account, which I guess you will, there'll be lots of videos of dogs doing funny things, so I can save you some time. Paul McLeod I've known of Paul's work for some time. Paul's a working journalist. He used to be up in Ottawa, working for, among others, the bureau chief for the Chronicle Herald up in Ottawa, which is, Paul, I think where I first met you. And if I was smart enough, I had a couple of national political shows that I was doing, and I hope I was smart enough to have you on one of my panels. And if I did, never once? Okay, so total failure on my part. Anyway, Paul is now down in Washington, D.C., where he covers American politics, particularly the Hill, I think, Paul. And if there is the homeland, if you want, of this sort of stuff that we're talking about, it's got to be Washington, D.C. So I will not take up any more time. I could go on for quite some time. But all the way from Washington, D.C., Paul McLeod.
Thank you, everyone. So I am not Alex Boutlier, who was initially listed in the program. He could not end up making it, so I did message him to say if he wanted to send me on his opening remarks, I could read them word for word, pretend they were mine. And he did send me some stuff, but it was mostly about an intrepid Toronto Star reporter who saved the internet, so I'm going to toss that out and instead talk a little bit about misinformation and incentives, which is something I'm interested in. So I work for BuzzFeed News. We have a lot of data, obviously, about how many people read our stories. And I can tell you the stories of mine that often get shared around the most are not the ones that are about issues that affect the most people in a real world way. It is often the ones that spark a lot of outrage against Donald Trump. Things that make the Trump administration, make it look like the Trump administration is doing something outrageous, which hopefully they often are, tend to do extremely well and get shared a lot. Now, despite what my trolls say, I am not paid by the click. I have the freedom to write about things that I think are important. But if I were at somewhere that my job performance was measured by page views, I mean, the incentive there would be, it would be obvious to try to torque stories a little bit, make them a little bit more outrageous, try to draw some more emotion out of people, and get them shared more. And if I worked for a place that did not have editors or editorial standards, then the incentive is to go even farther. Maybe you start twisting facts. Maybe you start making things up, taking wildly unfair or uncharitable positions, but in a way that is going to make people angry. That is a very surefire way to get your stories spread. So I bring this up, of course, because we are now in a time where we have a lot of new voices, new outlets, new personalities that are on social media and that are coming across exactly these incentives. And part of the issue is that it's not equal across the board. Craig Silverman covered this fairly extensively when talking about the fake news era, and I mean like the literal fake news era where you had these websites that were just making up stories completely and putting them on Facebook and getting millions of views. In the early days, they tried different sites across the political spectrum, and what they quickly found was that there was not money to be made in all of these equally. And the ones that were doing the best were the ones, particularly on the right, that stoked division, stoked nativist sympathies, and basically appealed to the basest instincts of people. Yeah. I'm really sorry. I'll try to speak a little bit loud. I'll try to project more. So I'm just talking about the incentives of the internet, and that the misinformation that does particularly well tends to appeal to people's ugliest natures. We can see this in Canada with the rebel media, where I followed them from the beginning, and I wish I had taken more screenshots, because it was really interesting. In the beginning days of the rebel media, which is a far-right website here, it was quite different than what it is today. It was really kind of an extension of the old Sun News. They dealt with a lot of what pretty mainstreamy political subjects that you would see elsewhere. And then as time went on and it became clear that that is not where the juice is online, they started talking more and more about immigration, specifically anti-Muslim immigration, stoking fears around immigration, and now that is a huge part of what their business model is. And we've seen this start to manifest itself in political ways. I mean, through Brexit. We are starting to see it through, I expect we will see more of that through this Canadian election. I mean, this is breaking through to the point where this is becoming a major factor in elections. So, the question for me is, what do we do about this? I have a couple of ideas. One is we blow up the internet. We say the last 25 years has been a mistake. We go back to reading newspapers and shopping at the mall. Plan B is a lot less clear. I mean, it's essentially we're talking about informational trench warfare. We're talking about fighting online to preserve a sense of truth, preserve institutions with editorial integrity, to preserve a common space where you can have non-toxic political debates. And this is something that will be very difficult, and we're pushing up against some tidal wave forces of misinformation, which brings me back to my plan A: we blow up the internet. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Interesting presentation. I would like to introduce the last panelist now, Anatoliy Gruzd, and I'm going to read a bit about him, but I think because he's Dr. Anatoliy and we have Dr. Elizabeth, it leaves us with a paradox. Dad joke, right? Am I right? Okay. Anatoliy is a Canada Research Chair in Social Media Data Stewardship, Associate Professor and Research Director of the Social Media Lab at Ryerson University's Ted Rogers School of Management in Toronto. You should see the size of this guy's business card. It's about that big to get all that in. But as Anatoliy will tell you, I think you've still got privileges here at Dalhousie, right? He was poached. Actually, it was a trade. Dalhousie traded Anatoliy for 2 first-round draft picks later on. He particularly studies how social media use is changing the ways in which people and organizations communicate, connect, and how these changes impact our society. And I know, Anatoliy, you're working on a major research project specifically on that now. And I'll warn you, it's not ready for publication or even talking about, but it's a tease to probably follow you on social media if Paul hasn't blown it up by the time you get there. Anatoliy, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. I hope I project enough. It's nice to be back at Dalhousie. As Tom mentioned, Social Media Lab actually was founded here 10 years ago, and then we moved to Ryerson. And some of the work I'm presenting today actually coming from our projects, and specifically the Election 43 Transparency Project. But before I get into this new project, I want to set a bit of background, and I'm very appreciative of my co-panelists who were able to kind of provide you some insights in terms of what bots are and what types of nefarious websites and actors are there. So that will help me to kind of interpret some of the data for you that we've seen online. There is understandable ambivalence when we're talking about social media and its use for political engagement. Why? Because when we see sites like Twitter, Facebook being used to support popular political uprisings, we see it as a force for good. But when we see it's being used to manipulate somebody's opinions or to promote hate, we see it as a malicious tool. And this is exactly what happened in 2016 during the US presidential election and, of course, UK's Brexit referendum, and more recently during the presidential elections in Brazil and Ukraine. This is when bad actors try to weaponize social media in an attempt to influence public opinions and potentially how they vote or not vote. We in the Social Media Lab really interested in studying the processes behind sharing, who is sharing misinformation, how it spreads, and we start with two fundamental questions: what and how? What types of misinformation is being shared, and how it propagates through different online networks? So the first question we usually address with different forms of content analysis, could include automated, semi-automated, and manual, and we're looking for the content of the messages to try to identify, is there a misleading content, fabricated, manipulated content? Is the content represents false connection between arguments or provides false context? So different flavors, as you can see, of so-called fake news. Then the second question is how this type of information or misinformation shared online. Then we turn to network science that helps us to answer this question. And when we use network science, it helps us to reveal hidden patterns of how information and misinformation flows from one social media user to another. And that usually involves representing data set in the form of a graph. And because I'll show you a couple graphs today, I want to give you a quick introduction. How do we do that transformation from the data set of, let's say, posts on Facebook or Twitter to communication networks? So I'm going to use Twitter example. And for the network that represent Twitter conversations, we start with nodes that represent Twitter users. And connections would indicate who is actually interacting with whom, who shares whose tweets, who mentions whom. We can also measure the kind of strengths of relationship or interactions based on counting number of interactions and maybe sometimes the types of interactions. So I'll give you a quick example. How do you build a network based on single tweet? So here's a tweet from Foreign Affairs Minister from Brazil, and he was visiting the White House last week, and he tweeted about this meeting with Donald Trump. So in his tweet, he mentioned 3 Twitter users. So based on this tweet, we can build a simple network of 4 nodes where you have the sender of the message, the foreign minister of Brazil, connected to 3 other individuals. So that will be the congressman from Brazil, Bolsonaro SP account, real Donald Trump's account because he was in the Oval Office at the time, and the president of Brazil, Bolsonaro. So now, once we have millions of messages, we apply the same transformation to millions of messages, and then we ended up with visually appealing, but also very informative network visualizations. And so then we use network visualizations to discover hidden patterns. who are the influential actors, how they influencing, who they influencing, or trying to, other different clusters, forums, and so on. So we're using this type of techniques to understand different interference campaigns. And last year in 2018, Twitter released a great data sets from research perspective to understand how a Russian Internet Research Agency tried to influence the US election in 2016. And this data set includes over 9 million tweets and retweets posted and shared by the account associated with this Russian agency. And as you can see, this chart shows a number of posts and shares from this data set. They actually started the activities way before the election in 2016, and the tweets actually started in 2011. But for today's presentation purposes, I'm just going to focus on 1 month leading up to the US election. And so that's about 200,000 tweets and retweets. And this is how the 200,000 tweets and retweets look like if we represent it, going through those steps I showed you earlier, as a graph, as a network. Each node, there are lots of dots here. Each node, green color node, represents regular Twitter accounts. And the red color nodes represent accounts that we know for sure were associated with a Russian Internet Research Agency. And so here's an example of the account at 10_GOP. That account, when it was active, it's blocked by Twitter now, was misrepresenting itself as an unofficial account for Tennessee Republicans and was actually again 145,000 followers. So to understand how these manipulation activities happen over the period of 1 month, we want to examine different clusters formation in this network. Why? Because it kind of suggests a strategy behind the activities, meaning that these red dots essentially kind of aggregated around different audiences and trying to send different messages or influence different stakeholders in this election. The largest cluster, which is a very obvious one, was mostly tweeting and sharing pro-Trump, anti-Hillary Clinton messages, which you would expect from misinformation campaigns in support of a particular candidate. But the second largest class was actually somewhat surprised to us because most of these Russian Internet Research Agency accounts were sharing pro-Black Lives Matter content. And at first it's surprising, but perhaps by supporting an opposition group towards their candidate, they try to incite incivility and polarization in a democratic society in hope that perhaps while two parties are busy fighting with each other, they're not paying attention to what actually is happening. The third largest cluster was mostly pro-Putin, pro-Kremlin type of content. It was mostly in Russian, so I don't think it was these accounts were targeting Americans, but it perhaps speaks about the broader disinformation campaign that they were trying to launch, and in particular, trying to perhaps make sure that the content of Russian political elites and news organizations like RT News were quite visible across social media platforms. Finally, the last cluster I want to focus on today mostly shared sports and entertainment cluster. First, you may think it's a very innocent entertainment content, but actually it's a common sort of bait and switch tactic where you have accounts initially sharing funny, engaging videos, pictures, and content, and you start following them. And as more people follow them, they get credibility, and then at the right moment, they start posting politically motivated messages to support a particular candidate. So finally, what was most especially interesting to us, that all of these clusters were kind of connected to official account for YouTube, meaning that a lot of links shared in the context of these political discussions were leading people to watch videos on YouTube. And that means that misinformation doesn't really stays within a particular platform, but it can start as a text message on Twitter and quickly form and engage or emerge as a funny picture on Instagram and then remixed as a video on YouTube. And so Canada is not, of course, immune. We're to this type of campaigns. We're one of the most connected countries in the world, with 94% of online adults having at least one social media account. And so that's why in the Social Media Lab, we really think it's important to follow and study the health of political discussions online, trying to understand who is trying to influence our opinions, especially during this election period. So we launched this transparency project, and as part of it, we developed in the Poly dashboard. This is public online data visualization tool. I invite you to check it out, polydashboard.ca. Today, I have 1 minute just to highlight some of the type of data you can find. So it mostly uses Twitter and Facebook as a data sources, as the two popular platforms for political discussions among journalists, elected officials, politicians, candidates. And so for Twitter, we're following the hashtag CDNPolo, which is the common hashtag being used for political discussions. We're trying to identify how fast Twitter trying to block bad actors, but we also don't wait for Twitter to block things. We automatically check all the public accounts who are engaged with the conversation on this hashtag to see how likely they are automated or not. And so with the machine learning approaches, we can see if somebody is actually been mentioned a lot, are they real people, or it's somebody is behind them. So you can see those charts. We're also trying to understand what kind of information or misinformation people are sharing by classifying all of the links being shared on Twitter. And for that, we're relying on public sources of known news media organizations, but we also hired graduate students with journalistic background who can help us to kind of classify and detect partisan websites, separate them from satire, think tanks, government and other websites. The good news, what you can see is the data for the last couple of weeks or so. You can see this large green slice of this stacked chart bar. And that shows that most of the social media users, when talk about politics, they do still share mainstream media. So that's a good news. The red slice, the second largest, is partisan websites, which you would expect in political conversations. Very few websites actually coming from our blacklist, sort of say. And they are, most of them about climate change denials and also anti-Muslim immigration sites as well. So this is just an example of one of the Friends of Science Calgary website that's floating out there. The final piece of the dashboard looking at the political advertisement, how, who is targeting Canadians and for what purposes. So you can see quickly we're using Facebook APIs showing you some of the most active funders of political campaigns right now. We collect data every day. So you can see fairly accurate representation of what's happening. And the largest party right now that spends on Facebook is Liberal Party of Canada, which I thought was interesting because the election hasn't even started, and here they're spending, they're running hundreds of ads. Most of the you can see the table is kind of separated by different price ranges, because when you run a small ad, short term, targeting relatively a small group of people, it may cost you under $100. But if you are running for a longer period of time or trying to really fine-tune your targeting, it will cost you a lot. So most of the funders of the political ads running ads under $100, but they are running many of them, hundreds of them. So they're able to kind of pinpoint different messages for different groups. What is also interesting, though, even though Liberal Party spends most money on political ads, there are third parties who are running on behalf of political parties. So for example, this, the United Steelworkers Union, so they actually spent since this database that Facebook released, start tracking in June, spent $17,000 on Facebook ads and $13,000 of which are on political ads. And those ads mostly in support of NDP candidates and the party. So there are lots of stats out there. We're going to be monitoring the health of conversations and looking at the credible and incredible sources. So stay tuned and follow Social Media Lab's website for more updates. So thanks.
Thank you, Anatoly. That was fascinating. Not the least which, because if you looked at that last chart, the second biggest influencer is the Conservation Council of New Brunswick. But I want to get to some questions right away, but I do want to ask you, Anatoly, in your studies so far, does Vladimir Putin like Justin Trudeau, or does he like Andrew Scheer? Which way is he? We haven't looked at that one yet, okay. That's great. We have about half an hour or so, a little bit more than that, to expand this discussion, and I want to take as many questions as I can, but I wanted to start off with Emily Bork. Emily, you're over there. There's a microphone coming your way. And if we could, just so we can get in as many questions as we can, if we could keep our answers relatively focused, that'd be great.
Sure. Hi. Can everyone hear me okay?
Emily, can I ask you to stand up and
Yes.
come here so everybody can hear your question?
Of course. Hi. Since analytics show that information flows between people in social network and how this can gerrymander or skew opinions, it has the potential to influence the outcomes of the elections. How can we strike a balance between exploiting the benefits of cyberbots and defending against their use for negative influence? How much of a role should automated technology have in monitoring this?
Did everybody get that question? Okay.
And
Well,
this one
generally
could be
for
for
the
Anatoliy Gruzd or
Brandy. And if I could summarize, Emily, you were saying, how do you balance off the bots against the negative and the positive, I guess, if I could
yes, and
be brief, and
also
who's responsible, right?
who's responsible, and if it should be sort of artificial intelligence regulations, or if it should be sort of a committee or a cabinet.
So should there be regulations on AI, and should there be a committee of cabinet or an independent commission that does it? Okay, I think we've got the question. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Anatoliy?
So it's a very complex question. In our own work, we do use sort of AI machine learning to detect bots. So here's an example how AI can be helpful to detect other AIs. So we cannot just stop using them. The other issue we haven't really talked about it is about recommendations that social media platforms generate, whether political or other type of recommendations, and those often driven by some form of AI as well. And the concern here that depending how the AI is fine-tuned, they may lead you towards certain points of view, so towards certain sources of information or misinformation, like recommending you anti-vaccination website versus pro-vaccination websites. So certainly the question of should we monitor or regulate AI-based technology is a huge one, and especially when we feel that AI technology may bias or lead us to certain opinions. I don't think there is a clear answer yet. There are lots of discussions about how do we frame it so that we can check the AI for its transparency, so how the actual algorithm was trained, whether the data sets that we use to train AIs are actually include some form of bias. I think we can spend the rest of the 30 minutes on that. But thank you for the question.
I just said politically, it's as you mentioned in your question, extremely difficult to deal with this with any kind of legislative solution, because very quickly you bump up against freedom of speech considerations. The way that it's been going right now is essentially when it becomes a big enough scandal, the social media companies will be pressured to address certain issues. If governments wanted to go a step farther, we could start talking about regulating social media companies and putting standards on them. It does not seem that any government, at least certainly in this hemisphere, has the stomach for that kind of fight right now.
Elizabeth, just to expand that out, I know the person who's heading up the division at Facebook, tasked with trying to figure this out. Does it ultimately, as a public policy question, rest on the distributors, in other words, Facebook, Twitter, and WhatsApp, and the others?
Right, so this gets to one of the crux of the problems we have with social media, not even just within the context of election or disinformation, but whether these organizations are simple kind of dumb conduits for information, or whether or not they are broadcasters, whether they are editors, the kinds of decisions they make impact the way that we end up regulating them, right? And so what we see now is most of these platforms see themselves and have admitted that they do play a curatorial role. They do play an important part in deciding what information we see and what information we don't. And so that has to be part of the policy response, thinking about their role. There are also a lot of other kinds of actors that can make use of automation and artificial intelligence, and the list of actors making use of those tools is only going to increase. And so I think it would be problematic for us to look only at the social media companies and not think about the larger system.
Hunter Gillis.
This is a question for Paul. What do you believe is more dangerous for democracy? The inability to distinguish fact from fiction, or an erosion of trust in our democratic institutions?
I mean, I think those things are one. This is very trite, but the main advice I try to give people is, read a variety of news sources, read things that challenge your opinions. And that is the exact opposite of misinformation campaigns. It's, you cannot trust the mainstream media. Don't turn on CNN. It's toxic and poison. I mean, this has led to a group of people that not only do not really know who to trust, or trusting very malicious and dishonest, and marginal voices. But then that goes hand in hand with complete erosion of trust in any kind of more mainstream voices. So I think they are both basically two sides of the same coin, and both of them I see as a massive threat.
Thank you. Lights have come back on. We've got power again. Thanks, Dorian. Herodia Indongo.
Thank you. My question goes to Dr. Elizabeth.
Can I ask you if you could step out here and actually face the audience as much as you can?
Thank you for the chance. My question goes to Dr. Elizabeth. Since we have different types of bonds, who is leading the discussions about bond? And is there any mobilization among the politicians, journalists, scientists, and IT specialists in addressing the misinformation issues?
Can you just, you said who is leading the discussion on, and then the
Yes.
camera flickered and I didn't hear.
Yeah, who is leading the discussions on bonds?
On
And-
bots?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, so who interacts with these bots is a great question, and it depends on the kinds of bots. Some of those bots have as their target existing communities, and so Anatoliy mentioned the bait and switch strategy, where they will be designed to go and interact with an existing community of people who have formed around a sports team or some celebrity or an existing hashtag and political movement like Black Lives Matter. And then they will slowly start to change, or sometimes quickly change, what kind of interaction they're having within that community to start sending out political and pointed and partisan often messages. So there's that group of people that ends up interacting with bots. I think the much scarier group, from my perspective, is when these bots are targeted specifically at political journalists. And so that can be either to dissuade those political journalists from doing their job, so the dampener bots, or bots that have been designed to amplify messages that they know, that their creators know political journalists will pay attention to, and then those journalists are the ones that get this out into the wider system. And that's when we start to see the ripple effect far beyond the reaches of those who are actually on social media. And that's when our media and digital literacy starts to break down, because we're taught to trust these journalists who adhere to journalistic standards and have editorial procedures and that sort of thing. And so then when we think about who can then deal with these bots, we need to think about a multi-pronged effort where a bunch of different actors and groups are all part of that solution.
Can I just jump in? I'll be take off my moderator hat for a moment and put on my journalist hat. Having been a political journalist in a couple of countries and had a couple of national shows here in Canada, yeah, we saw these bots coming in. My staff did and I did, and we paid zero attention. Where it becomes a problem is not hearing from, Ted in Greenwood, which is probably run out of somewhere just outside of Moscow, but it's when you get legitimate sources, such as the leader of a political party, amplifying what is clearly fake news. And I don't mean this as a partisan comment at all, so please don't take it that way, but it's just the most recent example that when Andrew Scheer retweeted a story that was demonstrably false, that Canada had signed a secret agreement to bring in 100,000 Palestinians. Now, if I read that on a bot coming my way, it wouldn't have occupied more than a nanosecond of my time. When you get it from somebody who occupies the position of leader of the opposition, you pay a little bit of attention, but of course you do some work. Now that was debunked within 24 hours, and so really the journalistic system worked then because something so outrageous coming from a credible source was immediately torn down. And so I just counter a little bit that political journalists are being taken in by this stuff.
So I mean, that is a perfect example, and one where we're dealing with the kind of bots that we saw a few years ago, which do still exist, and the kind of disinformation that, you know, might dupe somebody momentarily and then there's a debunk. We know also that debunking doesn't actually work in terms of changing people's opinions. Once they've seen it, they tend to take on whatever's going to confirm what they already believe and push away whatever doesn't, and then it doesn't matter if you get the debunk across your screen. But what I would say is the other way that these bots are designed to try and manipulate journalism is much less direct now, because there's a recognition that journalists aren't going to just take whatever Twitter post as at face value. They are designed to do things like create a sense of this is how the general public is feeling by manipulating what shows up as a trending topic, or by changing the tone of the conversation by throwing in tons of the same kinds of really positive or really negative posts in a hashtag or on a Facebook page that is commonly looked to get a sense of what the Canadian public feels. And those kinds of manipulative tactics are much harder to actually uncover. And the speed at which bot creators are innovating in how they're making use of social media or instant messaging or search manipulation, that's the thing that gets challenging, because journalists now need to not only know they've got to check the sources, but also how do they figure out how to check the gaming of the algorithm that's been happening, which is incredibly hard to do when social media companies and search engines have to keep a lot of that secret in order to not further be gamed by the hackers.
Yeah, you know, we think that these problems started when the internet was created. But let me take you back to pre-internet times. In this wonderful biography of LBJ by Robert Caro, recites a story, and I'll clean it up a little bit because I know we're streaming somewhere. LBJ said to his campaign manager about his opponent, "Let's go out, I want to put it in the next speech that this guy kills puppies." And the campaign manager says, "We can't say that. He doesn't kill puppies." And Johnson said, "Well, let's make him deny it." And, you know, that is sort of very much the same thing.
Sorry, I just wanted to jump in, Herodia, and then also a little bit in answer to your question. In terms of the question of whose job is it to regulate, responsibility is defined by the legislation. So the acts will state which department or which agency or organizations has the mandate to administer the act and what the limits and extent of that mandate is. And that's why it's important. So the slide that I showed that had all of the people involved, because questions like this and issues like this are too large, and they're developing too quickly for a single organization to say, okay, well, we're going to be the lead on this, and it's going to be our job to regulate that. Each organization within that matrix has their own area of expertise and specialization and the confines of their mandate in which they can operate. The legislation is very clear. It's not possible for organizations to operate outside of their mandate. It creates a lot of problems. That being said, the legislation is never going to be able to keep up with technology. And that's true of this area. It's true of a lot of different areas in the regulatory sphere. It's true of, I mean, I worked at the Food Inspection Agency. I can tell you that there's nothing in the current regulations that are prepared to deal with, okay, well, you've got lab-grown meat now. So whose job is it to inspect it, and what are the requirements to inspect? Like, that doesn't exist in the legislation yet, right? So technology is developing incrementally at a rate faster than the regulations can keep up. And that's why these types of collaborative frameworks are so important, because, you know, by working together, you can at least stop some of the gaps and while the legislators are figuring it out, right, how they want to legislate it, whether they want to legislate it at all. And I'll give you an example. So, you know, recently it's come in the media that a number of new parties have registered with Elections Canada or they've what's called, they're eligible to register, so they're not officially registered till they run their first candidate. And, you know, these parties represent a range of political views that a lot of people are uncomfortable with. So, you know, the question is, well, why can't you just turn down their application? Well, there's no mechanism in the Canada Elections Act that allows the Chief Electoral Officer to reject an application based on ideology. That does not exist, and really when you think about it, does anyone really want a single bureaucrat in Ottawa being the arbiter of what's acceptable ideology or not, right? And so really it's up to Parliament to decide if, like they have done, like certain countries in Europe have done, if they want to impose restrictions on certain thoughts or political ideologies from participating in elections. That's not Elections Canada's job to do that. And that's why, to come back to your question, it's really important in the election security context for all of those organizations to be working together.
Reed Thomas.
So, I have a question for Natasha. I know she just went off there, but I have another one. So, given their proximity to Russia and their experiences with Russian disinformation campaigns, the Baltic states, specifically Lithuania, have made the cultivation of critical thinking and improving media literacy components of their national strategy. I'm just wondering if this is a viable strategy for Canada, and if so, what are some of the biggest challenges in implementing it?
That's a great question. I think Paul might be better placed to act. Media literacy, again, is beyond the mandate of Elections Canada. What we do at Elections Canada is not so much educating the general public or you know, the broad electorate about media literacy, but it's educating the media. Like that is literally my job, is explaining the regulations and the nuances of the regulations, which can be really complicated, to the media, to make sure that at the very basis, what they're reporting, you know, is accurate and factual. And that's not saying that that media are going out there deliberately trying to mislead people, but it can be difficult to kind of grasp some of the nuances in the regulations, you know, about third parties and how are they financed and what are they allowed to do and what are they not allowed to do and when and all of this stuff. So we do actually a lot of work with media who are covering the election to make sure that they really understand the regulations, and we build a rapport and a relationship with them so that they can call us, even if they're not working on a specific story to a deadline, for example, and they'll say, hey, I'm reading through this part of the act. I don't really understand it. Can you just go over it, with me, over it for me, and we could talk about it. And we're happy to do that. And we, likewise, when there are changes to the act, we proactively reach out to the media who are covering this type of thing to make sure that they're aware that there are changes to the regulations and they understand what those changes are and how they compare to what it was before.
I'll just quickly add, I am wildly supportive of that. I think media literacy is, education reform is essentially maybe one of our only paths out of this. It's tricky because, I mean, in Canada we have a very decentralized federation. It's province to province that handles the education system. Same thing in the States, it's state to state. And so it's hard to get everyone on the same page, and also it becomes very contentious very quickly. Maybe less so here, certainly in the US, I can tell you that. There's a lot of paranoia around brainwashing people, indoctrinating people into certain ideologies, and any type of media literacy program is going to come up against it. So it's sadly difficult.
I just also want to add that there's a general sense that media information literacy is important, but it may not work as effectively for all of different cases. It may work well, let's say, for phishing type of attacks where you can have clear rules and to train someone to identify those attacks, but it may not work for someone with pre-existing belief systems who encounter misinformation online, and because it fits with their belief system, they will share it regardless. So I think we need to do a bit more research in terms of developing effective training strategies. The work we do in the lab, one of the projects that looks at the related issue of privacy and how do you essentially make people more aware how their data is being used by different third parties. And what we discovered, kind of this notion of privacy paradox, that we show them all these different visualizations to show, hey, this third party can use this data for these purposes. And after with this particular intervention, participants said, well, we're concerned about our privacy more because we're now aware of all these practices. But then later on, when you actually look at their behavior, has their behavior changed in terms of sharing less or less sensitive information? That hasn't changed. So that's why I think I'm advocating that we need to actually validate different training media programs to actually see if they're effective.
Daniel Dale has a very depressing story about this, of coming across basically a hardcore Trump troll and discussing with him about how what he was talking about was not true. And the guy was totally shocked to learn that these things were inaccurate. And he had this bonding moment. He told it as a touching story for years. And then later came across the guy on the internet, and he was going back to the exact same trollish ways and believing everything he had before.
And that's why we cannot put all the emphasis and responsibilities on individuals, because sometimes we don't even know how we're being targeted. Even with Facebook micro-targeting ads, yes, now we have some insights why we see in a particular ad, but there are so many variables that even Facebook doesn't show us. People can target you based on other pages you viewed or like. So even with media literacy, you wouldn't be able to apply those skills because the data is not available to you as an end user.
Let me just ask quickly, if anybody else would like to join the discussion, just raise your hand. Yes, sir. And then we'll come to you. Just wait for the microphone if you could.
This is a question for, I think, Professor Dubois. So in the Canadian political system, we contrast ourselves a lot with the American system, and I think we have a lot of understanding about cybersecurity and bots a lot from the United States in their last election. Canada has a different electoral system in the US in the sense that we're not in a constant electoral system. The US, we've seen, it's a nonstop campaign. In Canada, as stated by Ms. Gauthier, the writ hasn't dropped yet. So we have a campaign cycle of about like 1 month of when things go hard in the paint, to say. In relation to that, are we more or less susceptible to bots in that short period than the United States is in their long period? Like, do we have the capability to understand if we're being attacked or hit in that short time frame, and or will we only find out after? Or is it better to have that short little time frame that we can't be influenced as much from outside factors? So that's my question. So.
That's a great question, and definitely the structure of our campaign and the structure of our political system and the structure of funding to political advertising and various political groups has a major impact, definitely. But one of the things about how these innovative uses of technology and automation are applied is often the base is set well in advance of any actual election happening, right? These the Twitter accounts that Twitter identified as having Russian connections and being removed, many of them started as early as 2010 and didn't have a political impact that we were measuring until years later. And so in that context, it doesn't matter how short our writ period is. If people are setting that groundwork in advance, they're setting that groundwork in advance. What I think our shorter period does do is it allows for less time for confusion to just completely derail conversations, and it forces us to have a real concerted effort put into making the public aware of what issues matter, when and where to vote, what their options are in terms of candidates in their riding. Those kinds of things being in a shorter period of time reduce the potential for voter fatigue, which is a very real thing. People get very tired of hearing about politics all of the time, and in the Canadian system, we're less susceptible to having people just tune out entirely when automated practices and non-automated practices start being used to shift the way we are going to vote.
Let's go here.
Hi, I just wanted to see, I actually have two things I want to touch on.
If you could, can you make it one?
Yeah, absolutely. So it was kind of touched on before, but I wanted to bring it up. There's been a lot of discussion, both here and just in the general conversation, about how bots and fake news have affected the way that social media networks operate. But I haven't seen as much on how those forces have affected the way that professional news agencies have changed the way that they operate. So to anyone on the panel, how have you seen bigger networks like CNN, MSNBC, Fox, CBC, BBC change how they operate in the new climate?
Sorry, do you mean like in terms of, I'm not sure I entirely understand the question, in terms of relating, like reacting to bots, or just how they've changed how they cover the world?
Either or, honestly, however you want to approach it.
Well, it's a tough one to answer because I do think there's a lot more awareness. I do think that, you know, we were essentially flying blind for a while, certainly asleep at the wheel in terms of the size and scope of the problem. I mean, we had an entire presidential election where you had a huge epidemic of fake news, where you had millions of people on Facebook reading literally made up stories. And most news media, if they mentioned that at all, had no sense of the scope of that, and certainly didn't realize that it was as impactful as it was. So I do think there's been kind of a crash course in terms of the media handling, you know, being more knowledgeable and reporting much more volume and much more insightfully about misinformation. We've seen like the CBC, Toronto Star, BuzzFeed. We have misinformation teams. We have fact-checking units. You know, at the end of the day, though, there's still websites out there that you'll see these reaction stories of people are outraged about X, and then you look and it's, you know, a handful of Twitter users. So of dubious credibility. So certainly it's a mixed bag.
I can join in on that very quickly to say that at the dawn of social media impacting politics, we were all fascinated. And on the television side, you may remember, television shows would regularly show you tweets that were going on as you were doing the show. And in hindsight, that was a ridiculous thing for us to be doing. And, you know, and then, you know, you'd see a tweet go by on the screen saying, "Hi, Mom, I'm waving," you know. I would say that what it's done, though, is that now journalists have always sort of kept an eye on a few trusted sources that have proven their worth over time. And so you go back to that well over and over again. And as the noise increases and as the shouting increases all around you, you tend to focus just on that small, verifiable group of people that are really going to be able to tell you what's going on. So I think that rather than being lost in the sea, I think that we're focusing in even tighter than we've ever done before. Yes, sir. As a matter of fact, what I'm going to do, because there's a few hands up, if panelists don't mind, can we sort of bunch about 3 questions together? Because we do have to leave at a certain amount of time. So if we could go here, there, and here, that'd be great.
Okay, so my question really follows from this one that just previously with respect to the media, and is directed primarily at Paul and at Tom, having both worked in the US. Where does the, what I'll call the almost, I'm going to stress almost partisan bias that exists in certain media, so if you want a left-wing leaning view in the US, you watch, you know, MSNBC, and you want Fox. CNN tries to get in the middle somewhere, but we don't quite have that set in Canada yet. I'm going to stress yet. But where does this kind of fit in this whole context of the internet and the role, and how does it influence the whole system?
Great. And I think you're right there.
I teach at King's, and I just wanted to follow up on what a lady over here said, that Paul's colleague, Craig Silverman, will be speaking at King's to talk about that very thing, how media outlets have handled the election on November 7th, so it'll be afterwards. But I wanted to ask the panel what advice you would give everyone as social media consumers to avoid contributing to the problem by amplifying things in the process of trying to debunk or correct them.
Great, thank you. And I think is there someone right here?
I was actually going to ask something very similar. What is our personal responsibility? You talked about how debunking doesn't always actually work, and you talked about that disheartening story about how proving, like, you can reach someone, but they will go back to being in their ways. So what can we do to make sure that we're not perpetuating misinformation?
Okay, so we have essentially two questions here, unless, is there one more that somebody wants to put on the table? Right there in the back. And then we will deal with all of the questions that have been brought up.
So one of the things that we've seen coming out of the US, particularly in the last election cycle, is that this concept of fake news or misinformation online, it's possible for it to be co-opted by political actors who are trying to use it to discredit news sources that are in fact actually credible, but that are just saying things that they don't like. So one of the things I'm wondering as we're talking about how to deal with this issue is how do we have this conversation in a way where the lines between what is actual fake news versus what is politically inconvenient information are not being excessively blurred.
Great, thank you very much. So just to summarize for all of you, we've got a question of, is partisan media as we see it in the States going to come up here, and how does that fit into the ecosystem, the political ecosystem? Two similar questions about what are the responsibilities of the individual not to amplify and not to make the matters worse, and really as part of that, the last question, which was how do we carry on political conversation in an age where we are being manipulated? I
think I can try to pull a few of these together. You're absolutely right. There is, even among mainstream outlets, a very splintered, ideologically diverse set of media outlets. And to your point at the back there, a lot with the main outlets, it is a difference of focus. And this is really the defining difference. I mean, even Fox News, for all of its reputation, if you look outside of the personalities, they have real reporters and actual editorial standards, and they are not making things up. So they are going to tell you a very different picture of the world than MSNBC, but in terms of misinformation, a lot of the older, the more mainstream news organizations have editorial standards you can trust, which is something that I would be more willing to blindly share a New York Times story than a story from an outlet that I am not familiar with. I think that's a good rule of thumb, like who do I know that this is a reputable news organization? And my main piece of advice is always just when you read something, take a breath, take a moment, and just say, well, hold on a second, like, does this seem realistic? Does this seem credible? Should I look into this more? And just take a second to try to think of it critically before you hit that share button.
And check the date.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, check the date, because, you know, I think Luciano Pavarotti has died on a monthly basis for the past 10 years, right? But maybe I could answer also your question about what the responsibility is. So one of the things, particularly if you are seeing information pertaining to the election, pertaining to like where to vote, how to register, what types of ID you need to bring, check to see where it's coming from. One of the things I mentioned briefly is at Elections Canada on our website. So if you go to our homepage, you'll see a box. And what we've done is we've created a repository of every single public communication that we put out. So whether it's ads, radio, TV spots, newspaper ads, posters, bus shelter ads, videos, brochures, any type of mailing we send to, to reminders for people to register. They're all on our website, so that if you see something that you think, well, it says it's from Elections Canada, but is it really? Or it's not really identified. Is this from Elections Canada? I'm not sure. You can go on our website and check. And we hope that if people actually have seen something that ends up not being from Elections Canada, that they would let us know so that we can take action against it. But you know, always in terms of information about where, when, how to register and vote, that like just go to the source, just go to Elections Canada before you start sharing things or saying, well, my polling, oh, I just got a text saying my polling station moved.
I'm just going to jump over to Anatoliy here for a minute.
Just to touch on the first and second question, in terms of partisan websites, we don't really need to wait for major cable news networks to come to Canada to be affected by them. We did a case study with the Brazilian presidential election last fall, and we saw the rise of hyper-partisan websites in in online discussions. And so what they do, they push out more traditional media outlets from the circulation of information. And so in that context, conversations then become more polarized and potentially more extreme. And those are the type of environments, discursive environments where populism thrives, and leaders like Bolsonaro in Brazil or Trump could be elected. So that's one point. So we shouldn't be dismissing that we don't have cable news left and right. The other point in terms of personal responsibilities, I think one thing to add, report misinformation or what you perceive as inaccurate using social media features, social media platforms features that they offer you, because the way it works, the more people report something that is not right or a suspicious account, the more likely platforms will actually respond to them. So just kind of crowdsource that process.
So I can't believe we made it all the way through this talk and I didn't go on my "we need to define our terms" rant, which we no longer have time for, but I think Claire Wardell has done a really good job of talking about differences between misinformation, disinformation, fake news. If you go to your favorite search engine and search for Claire Wardell, you will probably find it. I'll also tweet out the link to the specific piece I'm talking about. There's also really great work from Data and Society, from the Tao Center, from Neiman Lab that are all talking about these kinds of issues, so go take a look there to help inform yourself. In terms of the question about what responsibility do we have as individuals, I think there are things like don't click on stuff to tell the search engine or the social media company that this is important and worth sharing with other people. Don't share it if you think it is not true. Make a new post and comment in those ways to help inform other people. The other thing that I think is really important is that we ask ourselves, why did this show up on my feed? Every single thing that shows up on your feed is there because somebody, probably lots of somebodies, want it there. Make sure that you are aligned with those people before you click and share and like. And then read laterally. Start with Facebook, fine, but then go and Google the title of that article. Then go check on Election Canada's website. Go talk to your friends and family, and that will help you get a sense of not only what this piece is and whether or not you can assign credibility to it, but also where it fits in the larger discussion.
And recognizing that we are the only thing standing between you and free pizza, I think it is time for us to take our leave. I'll just say the one bit of fake news that everybody seems to have taken in is about writs. Writs are not dropped.
They're issued.
Writs are issued. There we go. That's my little.
And it's not one writ, it's 338 writs.
So Elizabeth, Natasha, Paul, and Anatoliy, thank you all very much.
We're off to a great start in Policy Matters. I want to thank everybody for participating, the audience, the online audience, the panelists, and Tom Clark, of course. I'll mention that Tom has started a new podcast, The Talk. We're very excited about hearing all the broadcasts, and we encourage you to, how can they hook up to that?
Just go on to any of the Russian bots. They'll be
Touche. Thanks so much for coming. Next week, we're talking about food policy. We have a great lineup next week. Please come back next week. And good luck with your reparations and whatnot and getting back to school, etc. So thanks for coming. We'll see you next week.